Bring you greetings again this evening in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and I want to thank you tonight for your prayers throughout today and in the past days and even in the past weeks. I've been hearing that you've been praying for these meetings. We very much appreciate that, and we need that continually. And I want to bless you for that. Can I see the hands of the children tonight? Can I see your hands? Way up. Yes, thank you. Thank you for coming again this evening. I want to pick up our story. Last night, Henry had disappeared. He wasn't there. They looked through the whole castle, every room in that castle. They looked and looked, but Henry wasn't there. But when they were looking, they realized that not only was Henry missing, there were other things that were missing too. So they could only conclude that someone had come in while they were downstairs having their party. Someone had come in and stolen Henry. And as a result of that conclusion, they began to weep as though it were a funeral, because they didn't know what to do. Where was Henry? What had happened to Henry? It's a sad day for them. And while they were in the middle of weeping, and Margaret, who had been the one that was supposed to take care of Henry and had been so careless for only that brief little time, was just weeping, and she was on the floor, and her hair were all strubelig. They were all disarranged or whatever, and she was just, she was distressed. And all of a sudden, the door opens up, and Adele walks in. Frederick hadn't been hurt as bad as they thought he was. And as soon as she realized that he would recover and did not need her there anymore, she had made her way back as fast as she could, back so that she could pick up and be with her Henry again, because she felt like that's where she ought to be. As she walked into the room and she saw what was happening, all the people were crying and weeping, and she wondered what was going on. No one would answer her questions. She walked over to the little bed where Henry was to be, and Henry wasn't there. And she immediately realized what must have happened. And when she realized that, she began to faint. They caught her just before she hit the floor. And as she revived, came back to, and she realized that he'd only been gone for a few hours, she quickly sent the servants out all around the castle in different directions. Out, check, look, see if you can find any signs where Henry might be. What could have happened to him? One by one, the messengers started coming back. And Margaret was meeting every messenger that would come back. But there was no sign of Henry. Finally, the last messenger had come back, and there still was no sign of Henry. No one had any clues as to what had happened to Henry. Margaret walked around for days. She was sad. She was quiet. She was not her normal self. She was in terrible distress. And then one day, Margaret just disappeared. No one knew what happened to her. Meanwhile, something else was going on. There was a lady, a very wicked lady, who had been for days outside that castle and had been watching the castle in hopes of somehow getting into the castle. And it was she who had the idea of hiring the musicians and talking to them and asking if they would go in and have a party in that castle, with the idea that while they were having the party, somehow she would sneak into there. So while they were having the party, the gardener who had coaxed Margaret to go downstairs with him had been very careless and had left the garden gate on the back side of the castle open. And she came through that gate into the castle, up to Henry's bedroom, picked up Henry, snatched a number of things that she could just, whatever she could carry, and out of the castle, outside the gates of the castle, and out through and into the brush, where she hunkered down in the brush and held very still. I don't know how she kept Henry quiet. I don't know that. But she had prepared her way. For days she had prepared. She had put food at different places in anticipation for the time when she would have Henry and she would make this journey. She stayed in that brush all through the evening until night came. And then throughout the night, she took Henry and she walked and walked and walked and walked away from the castle. She had a destination in mind. Day would come, she would hide. And she would have the food there that she had stored in anticipation, had it at these various places. She would pick up her food. She'd keep Henry happy with it. She had her ways of keeping Henry happy and keeping him quiet. Throughout the night, she would walk. For miles she walked. Till finally she came, I am not sure, I think at least 3 days, she came to the mountains. And she began to ascend up through the mountains. The paths, ways, pushing her way up through the rocks and around, until she came to an extremely thick thicket. And she pushed herself through the thicket. And in back of that thicket was a large door. She pulled the key out, opened that door. The door opened into a large, looked like a tunnel. She got inside and she closed the door. She made her way down through this tunnel. It's like a cavern. And as she made her way down through this cavern, she came to a large room. And in that large room, there was a circle of men that were sitting there. They were smoking and playing cards. They were thieves. They spent their lives stealing from people. And they had for a long time, they wanted a hostage. So that if they ever got caught, they could tell the authorities, if you harm us, that hostage that we have is going to be harmed in the most merciless way. This was where Henry ended up. Down in that dark cavern. At that point, he was so young that he soon forgot all about the sunshine and all those things that he had seen. Come back tomorrow night. We'll tell you more about the story. Why don't we stand and have a verse of song? Would you, the chorister, please lead us in a verse of song of your choosing?
Breathe on me, breath of God, fill me with life anew, that I may love one another's love, and do what thou must do.
Thank you. Open your Bibles, please, to Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2. I'd like to read the first 12 verses of this passage. I really don't know why God laid this on my heart to preach. Today was a bit of a struggle. I started to prepare, and I thought it was one thing, and it ended up being something else. But I'm speaking out of this passage tonight as a challenge to us in our Christian life, because I believe that God has a call for every one of us that comes right out of this word. Beginning in verse 1. And again he entered into the Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house, and it's very possible that he was in Peter's house. Peter lived in Capernaum. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word unto them. And they came unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4, carried of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, Why does this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? And immediately, when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, Why reason ye these things in your hearts? Whether is it easy to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise, take up thy bed and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he said to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, Arise and take up thy bed, and go thy way into thy house. And immediately he arose, took up his bed, went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, We never saw it on this fashion. You may be seated. My title this evening is God's Roof Crashers. God's Roof Crashers. I believe that God has called every person who has felt the call of God and has answered the call of God. God has called you to be a roof crasher. God has a personal assignment for every person, and when we become Christians, we become the disciples and followers of Jesus, that's only the beginning. There's more to do, there's work to do, and there's an assignment that every person and individual has. And as I look here in this passage, I would that God would give me the heart of these 4 men. This man that was sick of the palsy, there was no way that he could make his way to that house to be in front of Jesus and ask for healing. In fact, I don't even know if this man was able to talk. I have no idea if this man was able to ask for healing. It's obvious there was no way that he was going to get to Jesus by himself. The Bible tells us that these 4 men, they brought this man there, and the house was full. Luke gives us a little more detail in Luke 5. It tells us that there were doctors of the law. This was not just a normal gathering. There were doctors of the law, there were Pharisees. It says out of every town in Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem were there. I believe this was some kind of official gathering where they were coming and they were cross-examining Jesus, it seems like. Their intentions were there. And so this was crucial timing. So these 4 men came, and they could have sat outside that house to wait until this assembly breaks up. But no, that's not what they wanted. They were urgent with what they were about. They went up on top of that roof. They broke up the roof. And down through, they left this man down, right down, it seems like right in front of Jesus. And it tells us here that when Jesus saw their faith. Now we often believe and or seem to think that faith is something that is very personal, and it is. But do you realize tonight that if you are a Christian and a disciple, you can impact those around you by your faith. There are times that a person does not have the ability to exercise faith. When a believer becomes sick to the point that the thought processes are not working properly, I believe other believers can exercise faith in behalf of that person, an individual. And I believe that's a call. Every person, every Christian has a call to intercede for his fellow man. Not only that, I believe that every one of us sometime will need someone, a roof crasher, to stand by us and to help us out in the time and the moment when our faith is small and weak. Turn with me to the book of Kings. I want to look at something here. 2 Samuel chapter 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21. We have in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have the story of how David whipped the giant Goliath. And we think of that story, and when we think of that story, we think of David as the man who was just, he had God on his side. He was a bold man. He was a strong man, a man of courage. And he knew that God had given him a call, and he was going to be a great leader in Israel. And now here he is king. And let's read in verse 15, chapter 21. Moreover, the Philistines had yet war against Israel. And David went down and his servants with him and fought against the Philistines. And David waxed faint. And Ishbosheth, which was the son of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword, thought to have slain David. And Beachy, the son of Zeruiah, succored him, and smote the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swear unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. And if you read on down through here, you find that there were 3 more giants that were out against Israel. One was the brother of Goliath, it says, as you read down through there. And they were out to get David. They really were. There was revenge on their mind. And on this particular time that we've just read about, David waxed faint. He still had the courage. He still wanted to be there. But something happened. His energy wasn't up to the task. Somehow or another, he waxed faint, and that giant, I suppose, was thinking, I've got you this time. I'm going to get you. And he was going to kill David. But a roof scratcher stepped in. And between the giant and David, and his life was spared. And I believe that there were times in our lives when we need someone to come alongside and lift up our arms and to pick us up and to grant and infuse us with courage that we ourselves and strength that we ourselves have not been able to find. And that's what the church is for, I believe. That's the call of God upon the church. And I say tonight, for all of us that are here, if you're a member of the congregation, you have a responsibility to look and to be body conscious of what your call is to your brothers and sisters that are here tonight. There's also a bigger call. There's the call to society around us, to our neighbors. There's the call to our families, and I want to look at some of those things as we go on. There's a call toward government. There's a call in so many spheres of life, the people you work with. There's a call upon you at times to be the interceder for them. We'll look at a passage back in the book of Genesis in chapter 18. Verse 17. And the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, and the Lord, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is grievous, I will go now and will see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abram drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? And we have here the passage as you go down through. As Abraham began to intercede, he realized that Lot was down there in Sodom, and that he was in danger because these men were going to see and to pass judgment upon Sodom. And so Abraham begins with 50. Surely, there's 50 people. And he begins to intercede. And then as he's interceding, and he thinks, you know what? Just what if there wouldn't be 50? Oh, 45. How about 50? Like an auctioneer in reverse. How about 30? How about 20? Well, you know what? What about 10? Why do you stop at 10? If you look at this, Lot and his wife, and 2 daughters, 2 unmarried daughters. It speaks of his sons. It speaks of his sons-in-law. So I believe Abraham thought if he gets to 10, surely Lot's family is with him. Surely his sons-in-laws are with him, his sons and his sons-in-law and his married daughters. Surely they're standing with him. There's 10 there. The city is safe. We have the promise from God that if there's 10, it's going to be okay. My friends, there weren't 10. There were 4, and even barely 4. What would have happened to Lot if Abraham had not interceded for Lot? I believe it would be very possible that Lot would have perished with that wicked city. But the scriptures refer to Lot as a just man, that delivered just Lot, who vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their wickedness. But Lot was not able to spare his family. He wasn't able to keep his family with him. And it's a sad story as he's leaving the city that next morning, and it seems like he was hesitant to leave. Till the angels finally, it seems they grabbed his hands and pulled him out of the city and said, flee to the mountains. And he says, oh, no, not the mountains. I was afraid of the mountains. Let me go to this little city, the city of Zoar. And if you look, you'll find that even the city of Zoar was spared because of him. I believe God has slated the city of Zoar to also be destroyed. But because he asked to go there instead of going into the... Why was he afraid of the mountains? He lived in the mountains before. He'd become a man of the city. Now he was afraid of the mountain. So he went to Zoar. But soon, before the chapter's over, in fact, I believe it is. No, it's the next chapter. He was out in the mountain. When he fled, I don't think he didn't stay in Zoar. After, I believe, the fire began to fall, he realized the city's no place to stay. And he went back out into the mountain. But part of Sodom had gone with them. And there was that thing that happened out there with him and his daughters. That was the incest and all of that. Something that God would not have wanted. Didn't please God at all. But it's because of what had happened and what they were used to in Sodom. And it come right out with them. My friends, today, Lot was spared because of Abraham. Yes, he was. And I believe that every one of us today have a responsibility toward our relatives. We have a responsibility as a Christian. We're not living in an island. We have a responsibility to pray. We have a responsibility to ask God for a hedge of protection around them. We have a responsibility to intercede on behalf of them. God would spare them. That God would protect them. That God would draw them toward Himself. And bring them back to be His people if they've fallen away. 2 Chronicles chapter 7. This scripture is often used for revival. And it's correct to be used that way. But in verse 14 it says, if my people, He's not talking to the world. He's not talking to the nation at large. He says, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and heal their land. Tonight, America needs healing. If you look out and around America, none of us would argue the fact that America has left the moral foundation that God has called for a righteous nation. America is pagan, my friends. America has no semblance of righteousness. But what is it that's going to hold that God is calling for here? If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then will I hear from heaven and will heal their land. Do you hear that? The salt of the earth. God's people are the persevering presence of the nation. Righteousness exalts a people, but sin is a reproach to any people. But my friends, tonight, righteousness exalts a nation. But there is not much righteousness in America today. And if there's going to be a revival in this nation, it's going to start with the people of God. And you and I can be talking about what's happening out there. And we can be bemoaning all those things, and that's okay for it to grieve our hearts. But the big thing is what's happening to us. What's happening to us? I'll tell you something that's happening. The media today has been very, very active and has become a tool of Satan. And what they are doing is they're constantly publishing what's happening out there, the crime and the sin that is going on. And they're putting it on the front page. And it keeps coming up and keeps coming up and keeps coming up until it's old hat. And when it becomes old hat, suddenly we lose our, we've gotten used to it. And we become calloused. And that which at one point looked extremely sinful doesn't look so sinful anymore. There was a time when even in normal society, the issue of divorce was looked down upon. There was a time when even in normal society, the issue of partial undress was despised and despicable. But it's not so anymore. And as happens, as we get used to something, we soften our stand on it. And now today, we are having issues with gay rights, lesbianism. Those things are just kept on the front page. And as long as they're kept on the front page, it's an issue. But bit by bit, it wears away at our resistance. And that's why it is so imperative that every one of us stays in tune with the Word of God, so that our conscience is sharpened, that sin is still sin and will always be sin. But we allow ourselves and our conscience to become dulled. We let ourselves get callous to those things until we barely think about it anymore. Then we ourselves are going to start slipping. This nation needs revival, but it's going to have to start in the hearts of God's people. It's not going to start out there. It's going to have to start in the hearts of God's people. Our oldest daughter is adopted. When she was a young child, she was a welfare child in our home. She and her brother. We wanted to adopt both of them, but we couldn't, because the brother was not released for adoption. He was younger than she. We were able to adopt her, and he left our home. We'd been in our home for a year and a half or so. Was he, 2.5 when he left? About 2.5 years old when he left. And he was a very, very, very crucial part of our home and family at that point. And when he left, he was crying and clinging. I was holding him. And the caseworker literally had to pull him out of my arms because he was and he was screaming and crying as they left. And the court assigned him back to his mother. And we lost contact with that boy until I think it was in the year 2017. The boy was found. I think by now it was 30 years later. The boy had been in our hearts all those years, and thinking of him and wondering if he's involved, if he'd been in the armed services, and what had become of that boy. And I remember making that call, that phone call. My daughter said, "Dad, would you call him?" She didn't have the courage to call him, but she wanted to call him. She wanted me to call him. I said, "Sure, I'll call." So I picked up the phone and I called. There was no answer. So the next day I called again. We'd traced him to what town he was. We had traced him that he was a car salesman. We didn't know what his hours of work would be. We didn't know if he could answer the phone at work or not. So I called, I think, 3 consecutive mornings, and I wasn't getting a response. And so she looked around through the use of the internet, is how we found him, actually. She looked around and she found more phone numbers. I think she had 2 additional phone numbers. So the 4th day, I believe it was, when I called again, and there was no answer. So I called his place of work. There was a ring. No one picked up. It was probably before hours. So I called, I gave up. And then my phone rang. And it was Michael. And I said, hello. And I heard this voice at the other end say, you called this number? I said, yes. I said, are you Michael Shannon? There was a long quiet at the other end. And he said, yes. I said, I don't know if you're aware of this, but years ago, you were a foster child in our home. We've never forgot you. We just would be interested in making contact with you. Would you be interested? He said, yes, I would be. I said, now I don't know if you know this, but you have a sister. And she is our adopted daughter. Would you like to meet her? And he said, yes, I would. I said, well, in a week or so, we're coming down that way, and we'd like to, if it's possible, we'd like to make arrangements to meet with you. So that arrangement was made, and we ended the phone call. About lunchtime, the phone rang again, and it was a very excited Michael Shannon. He'd had time to soak about what had happened. And he began to talk, and he told me how he'd been a policeman. How he had all kinds of, he'd been in the army. He'd been a policeman. He had all kinds of contacts. They had searched for his sister, and they couldn't find her, and had given up. He was all excited that we would be coming down there. And then he told me, you know what? I always knew there was someone that loved me because there was a Bible. We'd forgot about it. We'd put a Bible in his going away suitcase. My wife had signed in there. I didn't sign our name more than just your, I think, adoptive or your foster parents or something. And a couple words of love for that man. And over these years, he had never forgotten. He had a rough life. He had survived some very, very rugged situations, and we didn't know all that had gone through on in his life. But when we met with him and we began to visit and we began to talk. He calls us mom and dad today. He's never come to what we would say fully around, but he began to think, and as we had contact with him, he began to tell us of his life and his moral failings and so on, but there was absolutely no shame as he talked about it. Because the way he had lived and the way he'd been brought up, he didn't seem to realize that those things could even be wrong. Do you realize that we're living in a culture today that has been so calloused and so used to living in that way? Their conscience doesn't even talk to them about those issues. And I ask you a question. What's the difference between someone who has lived in America and has become calloused in that way because of television and all that has been brought in, and the African native that has never been taught What's the difference, friends? Both are lost. Both conscience has been seared to the speak of. Both conscience have never been awakened to truth. And do you realize that tonight the call of God is upon us as God's people? There are 5 Gospels: the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you, the Christian. 4 of those Gospels may never be read, but they're reading you. What are they seeing? Is the light strong enough to point them in the right direction? Is the intercession strong enough to make a difference and to bring them back? Turn with me to Job chapter 42. Verse 7. And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is kindled against thee and against thy 2 friends, for you've not spoken to me the things that is right, as my servant Job hath. Therefore take unto thee now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept, lest I deal with you after your folly. In that ye have not spoken to me the thing which is right, like my servant Job. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shunammite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did according as the Lord commanded them. The Lord also accepted Job. And the Lord turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends. Job's healing was not complete. His restoration did not come about until he interceded for his friends. Do you realize tonight that if I look at this, what God is saying here, I believe He's giving us an example that if we fail to intercede for our fellow man, the restoration and the prosperity, the spiritual prosperity of our own life as it ought to be, is not going to be complete. God is calling us. We have a responsibility. We're not an island. We have a contact with those around us, and we have a responsibility to impact them. Now, right now, here. Impacting the community. Some years ago, there was a man in our neighborhood by the name of Harbin, his wife Mary Beth. And I remember when I was taking the school children to school one morning, and I met this vehicle on a bridge. As I met this vehicle on the bridge was one of these little Virginia bridges. You really don't expect 2 vehicles to cross it at once. Well, the approach to that bridge was you couldn't see much beyond, you just could barely see the bridge. I mean, you saw the bridge. By the time you saw the bridge, you couldn't see much on the other side. As I came to that bridge, I saw a vehicle coming from the other side, zipping along at a pretty good speed. I jammed the brakes on, and I stopped, but the front end of my vehicle was on the bridge. The other vehicle saw me, jammed the brakes, came sliding across the bridge, and to this day, I don't understand why it didn't crash. For the last moment, she must have just got off the brakes and it just slid past. It's like how'd that happen? Well, we didn't hit. And so I proceeded on and dropped the children off at school and went on to work. But within minutes, there was a vehicle up in the front parking lot, and it was that vehicle. And I got the talking to of my life. I mean, the lady, she told me in no uncertain terms how I was a hot rod or how I was driving too fast on these roads and all kinds of things. She took me up one side and down the other, and I stood there. I listened to it all, and I apologized. I didn't know what else to say. And would you believe it, it wasn't more than maybe a month or 2 months later, I was going up that same road, and this time I was just creeping along, but I was looking down I had a truck patch on the left side, and I was looking at the crops or something, I forget. And I met this van at a narrow place where there was a culvert on this side. And as I got to that place, and I looked up, and I saw this van coming. And my heart sunk. It was Harvin. There was no place to go. And Harvin was coming too fast to stop. And I just remember seeing that van bounce up over that culvert and across. And I was like, oh my. Am I ever in for it now? And if you know mountain men, a grudge lasts a lifetime. He nodded his head. One of the church brothers, who was also a friend of Harvin and visited Harvin occasionally, said, Harvin told him later, I don't know why I ever forgave that guy. They loved to hold grudges. He doesn't know why he ever forgave me. Anyway, we tried our best to get along with Harvin, but the time came when Harvin and his wife both were so sick. They were unhealthy, and our church began to take food in for them. Basically, the sisters were bringing food in every day, pretty much evenings, I say every day, maybe 5 days a week. I'm not sure how it was, but it was quite frequently. And this went on for probably 2 years, year and a half, 2 years. And then one night, I'm going to say it was close to 12 o'clock, my wife woke and said, do you hear the sirens? Oh. I got up and I looked and I saw the red of the sirens as they're going up the road, and I quick got dressed and I went out and I got in my vehicle and I head up the road to Harvin's place. Their house was on fire. The vehicles were standing in front. There was no sign of life. They both perished in the fire that night. We realized that truth had been presented to them over and over again. But at night, I asked myself, am I free from the blood of Harvin and Mary Beth? You and I have people around us. They're needy. They need to feel and sense the touch of God. Do you sense the call that is upon your life to do that? Luke chapter 10. Verse 30. Jesus answering said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell among the thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. I'm going to stop right there. You know the story. Time is going faster than I have. What would have happened if the Samaritan had passed by on the other side as the other two had? That man would have probably died right there in the ditch. Today, we have, in our goings and comings, we have places to go and things to do. We're passing people as we go and come. When you go to Walmart and there's people there, you go to Lowe's and there's people there, or your places of business, and wherever you may be going, and you meet people or you're walking past people, and you have things to pick up and things you want to do, you realize that there is a divine opportunity right there by the shelves. And I've been a bashful man, believe it or not. But I freeze up at times when it seems like I ought to be talking. But I've found that times when there's something, when I'm beside someone, we're both looking at somebody, at something on the shelf, and there's enough stuff there to confuse you. Which one should I get? That sometimes just a little comment will just open something up. A while back, I was looking at some seat covers for my truck. I wanted to buy a seat cover for my truck. And it was really confusing. And another man was there, and he was also looking at the seat covers, and I said something to him about it. And it's just like, he began to talk, and he talked, and he talked, and he talked. He just needed somebody to listen to him. And I was like, I never saw that man again. I was like, you know what? I need to get over my bashfulness. I need to talk to more and more people. And I was at Lowe's sometime later, and I was buying a chain. I wanted to buy a chain. And they were on the bottom, and it was the man that was helping me there. He was also an older man, and we were both down there. We got on our knees finally to look at these chains, or close to our knees, and all of a sudden one of them said, he said, we ought to do more of this, shouldn't we? He was a Christian. We got blessed as we shared together how that God's people ought to be praying. And just things like that have happened. And I asked the question today. I asked myself the question, have I been picking up the opportunities? Am I getting a hold of it? This Samaritan, he saw there was a need. He had other things to do. He was going somewhere. But he stopped. He had oil with him. God has given you oil. You're carrying it with you every day. The oil of truth. The oil of mercy and compassion, I trust, is yours. And it's in your bag of things to do and a ministry that is there for you to do. As you carry that oil and you meet that need, you stop, pour the oil, put him on your beast, take him. Oh, it might be he's tattooed. He's a bad guy. You know what I discovered? Michael, tattoos all over him. And he's ashamed of them today, and he says it's one of the mistakes I've made. There are many nice people out there that have made mistakes like that. They've got tattoos all over themselves. They're ashamed of them today. They wish they weren't there. But sometimes because of our prejudices, we look at them and we automatically write them off because of the way they're looking. Good Samaritan didn't do that. He stopped. He poured the oil, gave the wine, took him to the place where he could stay and said, I'll pay whatever it takes. He bent over backwards to meet that need. We have the situation in Mark chapter 9. I'm going to have to hurry. Where there was a young man, there was a man that brought his son. And he said, Jesus, if you can heal him, do something. And Jesus turned the if right back to him and said, If thou canst believe, all things are possible. He said, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. And his son was delivered that day from the demonic oppression that had been there that day. It was the father's faith that needed to be there for that child. In your homes today, your child needs your faith to carry them through in the difficult times. Another scripture in Luke 22, verse 31 and 32. The Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. The avenue of prayer that is ours tonight is a privilege for us to use it for those around us who need a lift in their life. There may be times when there is nothing else that you can do but the prayer of faith. That is our assignment, is the intercession that is necessary to carry them through in their time of need. We have the word in 2 Kings chapter 5. It's just, I'm going to give this as closing. Where there's that young girl who was in the home of Naaman the Syrian. And she told her mistress, would God that Naaman would go to the prophet in Israel, he could be healed. That was a word of faith. The Bible tells us later, Jesus, I believe it was, referred to that there's none of the lepers, there was no other lepers that were healed except Naaman the Syrian. This girl, this young girl, she was captive. She wasn't embittered because of the fact that she was a captive, but she looked at the need of her master and she said, if he'd just go to the prophet, he'd be healed. That was faith. She'd never seen the prophet heal somebody with leprosy, because the Bible tells us he's the only one that was healed. But she had faith it could happen. And she told Naaman that. Naaman goes and he's healed. The faith of that young girl who expressed her faith against all odds, and God honored that. What a blessing and what a challenge. Tonight, every one of us is called to be a roof crasher, to touch the lives of those we meet, make a difference in the lives of other people. And I want to lay that challenge to you tonight. In the coming days, pick up the challenge. Make it a part of your life. Make it a part of your purpose. God has called you to that. As you and I have become free, it's God's will that there will be others that will be set free too. Could be those of our family. Could be those that we work with. Could be those we meet at Walmart. It could be even those who are in government. How do you sense God's call upon your life tonight? Shall we stand for a word of prayer?